everyone. We're doing something that, well, it affects all of us, right? We're diving into the American economy, or at least two very different visions for it.
You're not kidding, it's a big one.
We're talking about Vice President Kamala Harris's 2024 campaign book. It's called A New Way Forward for the Middle Class.
Right, and on the other side, we've got, let me see, Mandate for Leadership, the conservative promise. That was from the think tank Project 2025.
So two very different perspectives, to say the least.
Absolutely. And, even when you just look how each of these sources frames the current state of the economy, it's like they're looking at two different worlds.
It's true. Like, Harris acknowledges that things are tough, people are struggling with the cost of living.
But she keeps coming back to job growth under the Biden-Harris administration, right? Like, we're making progress, but we need to do more.
Exactly. It's that kind of cautious optimism.
Yeah, something like that. But Project 2025, they're not mincing words. They put the blame for inflation and what they see as problems with American manufacturing squarely on the shoulders of the Biden-Harris policies. They're basically saying, this isn't working. We need a completely different direction.
It's a pretty stark contrast,
to say the least. And it becomes even more obvious when you look at how they each propose to provide tax cuts and relief to working families.
Because Harris's plan is all about direct aid, right?
Exactly.
Like making the expanded child tax credit permanent.
Which would be huge for families.
We're talking up to $3,600 per child for most families, and even more for families with infants.
It's about putting money directly into the pockets of people who need it most.
And then there's the earned income tax credit, which she also wants to expand.
Potentially a tax cut of up to $1,500.
Right, and that one's specifically targeted at lower income individuals and couples.
It could be a game changer for those folks. Think about a family struggling to make ends meet. That extra money could be the difference between putting food on the table or falling behind on bills.
Absolutely. It's about providing that immediate, tangible relief. Now, contrast that with Project 2025.
Night and day.
They're pushing for something completely different. They're picking up on Donald Trump's idea of a national sales tax on imported goods.
Interesting.
Yeah. On the surface, it might sound appealing, right? Like we're supporting American-made products.
Sure.
But their own estimates suggest that this tax would actually end up costing the average American family close to $4,000 per year.
Wow. It's a perfect example of how the actual impact of a policy can be very different from how it sounds at first.
Yeah, suddenly it's not about some abstract economic theory. It's about how much more you're paying for your everyday stuff.
Exactly.
And that kind of brings us to another area where these two visions clash, food and grocery costs.
Right, another one that's front and center for a lot of people.
Absolutely, and Harris is really focused on strengthening those supply chains.
Making them more resilient.
Right, and diversifying our food production. She also wants to crack down on what she calls unfair practices, particularly price fixing that happens, like after a natural disaster or an emergency.
Which, let's be honest, we've all seen it.
Right. After that last hurricane, remember how prices for everything just seemed to skyrocket?
Oh, yeah.
She wants to prevent that kind of thing from happening.
It's about using the power of the government to protect consumers. Now, Project 2025... they have a different solution.
They do.
They're really pushing for these stricter Buy American rules for food.
Okay, so on the one hand, it sounds patriotic, right?
Yeah.
Supporting American farmers and producers.
Right. But like we were just talking about with that national sales tax, it could lead to higher prices at the grocery store.
Because we might end up having to limit those cheaper imports, even if they could bring costs down.
Exactly. It really highlights that tension between supporting American industries and, well, what people can actually afford.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, at what point does that trade-off become too much?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And speaking of trade-offs, let's talk about healthcare. That's another one of those hot-button issues where these visions diverge pretty dramatically.
To say the least.
Harris wants to build on the Affordable Care Act, making those tax credits permanent and giving Medicare more negotiating power when it comes to drug prices. Plus, she wants to tackle the mountain of medical debt that's weighing so many Americans down.
It's all about using the government as a tool to try to improve people's lives, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as healthcare. But then you have Project 2025. They basically want to go in the complete opposite direction.
Yeah, they're hitting the reset button.
Exactly. Their plan actually calls for repealing the Affordable Care Act.
Just wow.
Think about the potential ramifications of that. Millions of people could lose their health insurance. And those with pre-existing conditions, they'd be facing a lot of uncertainty about their coverage and their costs.
It's a stark reminder of just how much is at stake in this election, right? These aren't just abstract policies. We're talking about decisions that have the potential to affect real people in very profound ways.
Absolutely. And it's not just about access to healthcare, it's about the cost.
Yeah.
Harris, she really zeroes in on the issue of prescription drug prices.
Right, right.
Her policy book specifically talks about how the Inflation Reduction Act allows Medicare to negotiate the price of certain drugs. And she even points out that something like 10 million Americans have had to skip filling prescriptions because they simply can't afford them.
That's heartbreaking, and it just goes to show how important these policy debates really are. We're not just talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about real people who are struggling to afford the medication they need.
And speaking of the Inflation Reduction Act, that brings us to another area where these two visions diverge.
Energy, right.
Energy, yeah. Harris, she's really proud of the Act's investments in clean energy.
She calls it the biggest effort in history.
And she points to things like, energy costs going down.
And all those new manufacturing jobs that have been created in the clean energy sector.
It's about tackling climate change while also trying to create economic opportunities.
Right. But Project 2025, they see this whole thing very differently.
They do. They want to roll back those clean energy investments. They argue that they're ineffective and that we're basically just handing over leadership to China in the process.
It's that classic debate. What's the role of government and what's the best path to energy independence? Should we be investing in these newer technologies and industries, or should we stick with the more traditional energy sources? It's a big question.
Huge implications, not just for our economy, but for the environment and national security.
And it's a question that, ultimately the listeners are going to have a say in.
They will.
While we're on the topic of things that directly impact people's lives, I want to talk about those pesky junk fees.
Oh, tell me about it.
Those resort fees that seem to double the price of your hotel room? Or those random bank charges that just appear out of nowhere?
The worst.
Harris is going after those. She's trying to make it easier for people to cancel subscriptions, and she wants to give government agencies more power to protect consumers from what she sees as unfair practices.
It's a smart move, politically speaking.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. People hate these fees. They feel tricked, like it's this hidden way for companies to squeeze more money out of them.
I get that.
By focusing on these seemingly smaller annoyances, Harris is actually tapping into this much larger sense of frustration. People are frustrated with corporate greed. They're frustrated with this lack of transparency.
Yeah, and that feeling of being taken advantage of.
Exactly. It really speaks to that desire for fairness. Transparency, right? When it comes to our money especially, and while we're talking about things that hit close to home, maybe we should talk about the housing crisis.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's on everyone's mind for a reason. And Harris, she lays out this whole multi-pronged approach in the book.
Okay, so what's the plan?
She wants to make housing more affordable. And, she's really trying to tackle this from every angle.
Let's break it down then.
So first, she wants to expand the supply of affordable housing. We're talking tax credits, things like that.
Makes sense.
But she's also talking about new tax credits, specifically for rehabilitating existing homes. And then on top of that, there's down payment assistance.
So that's for first-time home buyers.
Right. And then she's taking aim at those big corporate landlords.
So the ones who are buying up properties and then jacking up the rent, right?
Exactly. It feels like she's really trying to level the playing field, especially for people who, maybe they haven't had the chance to build generational wealth or rely on family to help them buy a home.
Absolutely. It's about making that dream of home ownership a reality for more people.
So where does Project 2025 land on this?
They are not on board.
Oh, yeah, they're very critical of these big federal housing programs. They call them inefficient. They say they distort the market.
Interesting.
They actually want to scale back these programs, which, by the way, Harris's team argues, could actually make housing less affordable.
Especially for those first-time buyers we were just talking about.
Exactly. So, again, you see that same goal, right? Making home ownership more accessible.
But the methods are completely different.
Completely. And it's another perfect example of how these different approaches, these competing visions for the country, they have real-world consequences.
They really do. It's not just theoretical. These decisions, they affect people's lives.
Absolutely. And this whole back and forth between more government involvement versus letting the market do its thing, well, it comes up again when you look at how each of these plans approaches small businesses.
Right, because both of them acknowledge that small businesses are kind of the backbone of our economy,
Oh, absolutely.
but they have very different ideas about how to support them. Right.
Very different. So Harris, she sets this ambitious goal. She wants to see 25 million new business applications during her first term.
Okay, 25 million, that's a lot. So how does she plan to make that happen?
Well, she's got a few ideas. She wants to expand that startup expense deduction.
Okay.
She wants to cut through all the red tape that businesses have to deal with.
Because that can be a huge burden, especially for smaller businesses.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, she wants to give small businesses better access to those federal contracts.
So she's really trying to give them every advantage, every opportunity to succeed.
Exactly. It's a very proactive, hands-on approach.
Right.
The idea is to remove those barriers and just give these aspiring entrepreneurs the tools they need. Now, Project 2025, they're coming at it from a completely different angle.
They're taking a more hands-off approach.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
They're much more in favor of deregulation.
Basically get the government out of the way.
Exactly. They're all about those across-the-board tax cuts.
Yeah.
Their argument is that this is going to create this business-friendly environment.
And that's going to benefit everyone, including small businesses.
Right. So it's that classic argument. Do you provide targeted support, or do you go for those broad-based measures that will hopefully lift everyone up?
Right. It's like trickle-down economics versus a more targeted approach.
Exactly. And it's a debate that extends to another really important area, investing in innovation and creating a skilled workforce.
Okay, so how do they each approach that?
Well, Harris is really focused on making those strategic investments. She wants to put money into industries like clean energy, semiconductors.
Okay, those industries of the future.
Right. And she wants to make sure that we have the workforce to support those industries. So she's really pushing for these robust workforce development programs.
So it's about making sure people have the skills they need to compete in this new economy.
Exactly. And of course, she's a big proponent of unions.
She sees that as a vital part of a strong middle class.
Absolutely. Fair wages, benefits, safe working conditions, all of that. And this is actually one of the areas where there's this very clear contrast with the Trump administration. Remember, he really made an effort to weaken unions.
He often sided with businesses over labor.
He did. He argued that by cutting regulations and taxes, businesses would thrive, and eventually those benefits would trickle down to workers in the form of higher wages.
So less about directly supporting workers and more about creating this overall environment where businesses can grow and hopefully share those gains.
Exactly. Project 2025, they're very much aligned with that philosophy. They believe the private sector is really in the driver's seat when it comes to innovation, to creating jobs. They see much less of a role for the government in shaping the workforce.
So it all comes back to that fundamental question, what is the role of government in the economy?
It's a question that has been debated for decades.
And there's no easy answer, right?
Right. But it's a question that we as a society have to grapple with. How do we create an economy that works for everyone? How do we ensure that everyone has a chance to succeed?
Because that's what it's all about, right?
Absolutely. And those questions, they become even more weighty, even more urgent when you start talking about retirement security.
Because that's something that's on a lot of people's minds, especially as they get closer to retirement.
Absolutely. And both of these sources, both Harris and Project 2025, they talk about retirement security in their plans.
Okay.
But, as you might expect, their solutions are very different.
So let's start with Harris. What's her approach?
She's very clear. She wants to protect Social Security and Medicare. In fact, she wants to strengthen those programs. She's committed to making sure that they're solvent for the long haul.
Because those programs are a lifeline for so many seniors.
Absolutely. And Harris, she argues that the way to ensure their future is to make sure that corporations and the very wealthy are paying their fair share in taxes.
It's a message that resonates with a lot of people, especially those who rely on those programs or who are worried that they won't be there for them when they need them.
Absolutely. Now, Project 2025 has a different perspective.
Okay, so what's their take?
They've actually proposed raising the retirement age for both Social Security and Medicare.
Which essentially means reducing benefits for a lot of people.
Exactly. Their argument is that with people living longer and with healthcare costs continuing to rise, those programs just aren't sustainable in their current form.
I see. So they're trying to find a way to make the math work.
Exactly. But Harris, she pushes back on that. She argues that there are other ways to ensure the solvency of those programs without cutting benefits.
Like closing tax loopholes that benefit the very wealthy.
Exactly. She argues that the ultra-wealthy are able to use these loopholes to pay a much smaller percentage of their income in taxes than the average American. And she wants to close those loopholes.
So again, it comes down to this question of fairness.
It always does. Do we prioritize protecting the most vulnerable among us, the people who rely on these social safety nets?
Or do we prioritize shrinking the size of government and reducing the tax burden on businesses and higher earners?
It's a classic debate, and it's one that has real consequences for millions of people. And speaking of taxes, well, that's another area where these two visions really clash.
Because it's that age-old debate. Do we tax the wealthy more to fund social programs and try to reduce the deficit?
Or do we cut taxes across the board, hoping that it will stimulate economic growth?
Right, and Harris is very much in the camp of raising taxes on billionaires, on those large corporations.
Exactly. But she's also very clear about this. She has said that no one making under $400,000 a year would see their taxes go up under her plan.
So she's really trying to draw that line in the sand.
She is. She argues that the current tax system is fundamentally unfair, that it's rigged in favor of the wealthy and corporations.
And she wants to level the playing field.
Yeah. Exactly. Now, Project 2025, their stance on taxes is very much in line with traditional conservative thinking.
Which is lower taxes across the board.
Exactly. They argue that if you lower taxes, it's going to spur economic growth, you'll see more investment, more job creation, and ultimately, they argue, higher wages for everyone.
Right, it's that rising tide lifts all boats idea.
Exactly. But Harris, she argues that we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't really play out that way.
What does she mean?
She points to the Trump tax cuts back in 2017. Remember those?
I do.
Well, those tax cuts, they largely benefited wealthy Americans and corporations.
Right.
But they didn't really lead to this surge in wages or broad-based economic growth that was promised.
So it's another one of those classic examples of these two different schools of thought battling it out.
Two very different approaches to trying to solve the same problems.
And ultimately, it's up to us, the voters, to decide which approach we believe in.
Which path we want to take.
It's a big responsibility, for sure. And it requires us to stay informed.
It really does.
It's a lot to take in, right? We've covered so much ground.
We really have. From those big picture questions about the government's role in the economy and the best way to boost growth, to how much we might pay for groceries or medicine.
And I think it shows how these policy debates, these competing visions, as we've called them, they're not just abstract ideas. They really do have a direct impact on our daily lives.
Without a doubt. Both Harris and Project 2025 argue that their plans are the best path to improve the lives of everyday Americans. They just have very different ideas about what that looks like and how to get there.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for everyone listening to really engage with these ideas. Don't just take our word for it or anyone else's.
Read the proposals yourselves.
Right. Listen to the candidates.
And then decide for yourselves which vision really connects with your values and your hopes for the future.
It's your future, your voice, and your vote. So make it count.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about. Something that builds on what we've discussed, but takes it in a slightly different direction.
Okay, I like it.
Both Harris and Project 2025, they talk about the importance of education and workforce development. It's key to a strong economy.
Right, makes sense.
But, and this might not surprise you, their approaches to education are pretty different.
I bet. So give us the rundown.
Well, Harris is all about investing in public education. She wants to make college more affordable, and she's really big on expanding those apprenticeship programs.
It all ties back to her focus on creating that skilled workforce for those growing industries, like clean energy.
Exactly. She's saying if we want a top-notch workforce, we need to invest in top-notch education and training, and it has to be available to everyone. But Project 2025 has a different take. They're much more about school choice, promoting those charter schools, voucher programs.
We're putting their faith in competition. The idea being that if parents have more options, schools will have to improve to attract students.
Exactly. It's a market-based approach to education reform. They're also not crazy about government involvement in things like setting the curriculum or standards.
They'd rather leave those decisions up to local communities.
Exactly. So we're left with this fundamental question, and we want to hear what you think. Which approach do you believe will best prepare the American workforce for the challenges, and let's not forget, the opportunities of the 21st century?
Is it about increasing investment in education, making sure that a good education is available and affordable for everyone? Or is it more about giving parents more control, more choices, and letting those market forces drive innovation in education?
It's a question with huge implications for our kids and for the future of our country. There are really strong arguments to be made on both sides, so we'll leave that with you to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.